The scream that tore from Beatrice's throat was not the sound of a woman in pain. It was the sound of a world view shattering in the middle of the pristine asphalt of Sunflower Drive. Under a sky so blue it looked painted, the golden queen of the suburbs was being reclaimed by the very earth she had tried to pave over. It started at her ankles, a cold, vibrating pressure that felt like living velvet, and within seconds, her legs were no longer hers. They were a writhing, brown mass of ancient chitin and translucent wings. The insects didn't sting or bite. They simply clung to her with a weight that felt like the accumulated sins of her 40 years. As the swarm climbed higher, her bright orange flip-flops became anchors, pinning her to the ground she had spent a lifetime looking down upon. She had laughed when the old man at the edge of the woods warned her of the land's memory, but as the hum of a million wings drowned out her own heartbeat, Beatrice finally understood that the joke was over. To understand why the gods chose this reward for Beatrice, one must understand the shadow she cast over Willow Creek. Beatrice was a woman who believed that beauty was a shield for cruelty. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, a position she used like a scalpel to bleed the joy out of the neighborhood. She was the one who sent a cease and desist to the elderly widow 3 doors down because her memorial garden for her late husband grew 3 inches past the regulated height. She was the one who called the city to report the noise violation of a neighborhood kid's lemonade stand. Beatrice didn't just want order, she wanted a world where she was the only thing allowed to shine. For a decade, she had systematically dismantled the character of the street, replacing overgrown oak trees with uniform, sterilized saplings, and turning the community's wild shared spaces into restricted, gated zones that required a key only she possessed. Her house was a fortress of beige and white, a monument to a life scrubbed clean of any spontaneity or mess that nature might dare to provide. Her most recent act of malice involved the Sacred Grove, a small, wild patch of land at the end of the cul-de-sac that local legends claimed was a gateway to the old world. To Beatrice, it was an eyesore. It was unmanaged biomass that lowered property values. Despite the protests of the town's elders, she used her husband's legal firm to bypass environmental protections. The day the bulldozers arrived, an old woman named Ilara, whose family had lived in the valley for 7 generations, stood in the path of the machines. Ilara had whispered, her voice like dry leaves, that the earth there was not just dirt, but a vessel holding the spirits of the small, the overlooked, and the crushed. Beatrice had laughed, a sharp, musical sound that felt like a slap, and mockingly poured a bottle of expensive champagne onto the scorched earth. She told Ilara that if the spirits wanted to stay, they should start paying their HOA dues. She believed her wealth and her concrete could silence any ancient ghost, never imagining that the earth was a vessel capable of filling itself back up with the very things she feared most. The summer solstice was meant to be Beatrice's victory lap. The grove was gone, replaced by a flat gray expanse of high-grade asphalt. She dressed in her finest floral shirt, green, to mock the nature she had conquered, and stepped out into the street. She wanted to stand in the exact center of where the grove used to be, just to feel the triumph under her feet. She stood there, mocking the empty air, daring the spirits to show themselves. Then the ground breathed. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a sigh. A deep, rhythmic thrumming began to radiate from beneath her road, centering directly under her flip-flops. Then came the smell, the heavy, cloying aroma of ancient honey, damp caves, and 1,000-year-old rot. It was the smell of the world before people, before concrete, before Beatrice. She looked down and saw the first one, a cicada the color of rich mahogany, its eyes like tiny garnets. It crawled out of a hairline crack in the new asphalt and headed straight for her foot. When she tried to crush it, 1,000 more erupted from the crack. The joke of the curse began to turn into a cold, hard knot in her stomach as the insects flowed over her sandals like a river of bronze. This is the moment frozen in time, a woman of high status becoming a living monument to the very things she tried to erase. The deep emotion of the scene came from the silence of her neighbors who watched from their porches but did not move to help her. They saw the Golden Queen finally being humbled by the small things she had deemed insignificant. As the swarm covered her, Beatrice didn't just feel their legs, she felt their memories. The insects acted as a neural bridge, a psychic link between her mind and the land she had violated. She felt the vibration of every bird that had lost its nesting branch and every worm that had been crushed by the bulldozer. She felt the silent, centuries-old patience of the roots that had been ripped from the dark. The reward from the god of the land was empathy, forced, agonizing empathy. She was being made to feel the collective grief of the grove. She was anchored to the dirt, forced to sit in the heat until she understood that she was not the master of the land, but a guest who had overstayed her welcome. For hours, the sun beat down on her, but the swarm provided a terrifying, pulsating shade. She tried to scream for her husband, for the police, for anyone, but every time she opened her mouth, the hum of the insects grew louder, vibrating against her teeth until her very skull felt like it was made of glass. She realized then that her voice had no power here. In the world of concrete and contracts, she was a giant, but in the world of the Atshetsip, the ancient guardians of balance, she was merely a loud, disruptive noise that needed to be muffled. The insects formed a living tapestry over her, their wings beating in a slow, hypnotic unison that mimicked the breathing of the earth itself. The horror was not in being bitten, for they never broke her skin. The horror was in the absolute loss of autonomy. She, who had controlled every aspect of her neighbors' lives, was now unable to move a single finger without the permission of 1,000,000 tiny creatures. As the sun began to set, the swarm remained, a vibrating brown shroud that kept Beatrice trapped in the middle of the street. Her screams eventually gave way to a ragged, exhausted sobbing as the joke of the curse turned into a permanent reality. The story of Beatrice isn't about a monster being destroyed, but about a soul being pruned back to its roots. The god of the land didn't want her dead. He wanted her to be the one thing she always feared: ugly, helpless, and part of the mess of nature. The neighbors began to turn on their porch lights, the warm yellow glows casting long shadows over the woman in the road. No one called the authorities. It was as if a collective understanding had washed over the street, a recognition that this was a divine audit, a settling of a debt that had been growing for years. They saw in Beatrice's predicament a reflection of their own silence in the face of her cruelty, and in that silence they found a strange, somber peace. The night brought a new kind of terror. In the darkness, the bioluminescent eyes of the ancient swarm began to glow with a faint, ghostly green light. From a distance, it looked as though a fallen star was pulsing in the middle of Sunflower Drive. For Beatrice, the night was an endless cycle of visions. She saw the valley as it was before the houses, a vast emerald sea of ancient trees where the air was thick with the songs of 1,000,000,000 insects. She saw the ancestors of the people she had bullied, men and women who treated the soil with reverence. She saw the true cost of her perfect life, the displacement of life, the silencing of the wild, and the arrogance of thinking that a deed to a house gave her ownership over the soul of the earth. The insects were not just her captors, they were her teachers, whispering the history of the land into her pores until her ego was stripped away, layer by painful layer. When the swarm finally dissipated 3 days later, it did not scatter. It simply sank back into the ground, the cracks in the asphalt sealing themselves shut as if they had never been there. The street was silent once more, but the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from the neighborhood. Beatrice was left shivering and covered in a fine golden dust in the middle of the road. Her floral shirt was tattered and her orange flip-flops were ruined, but as she looked at her hands, she didn't see the dirt as something to be scrubbed away. She saw it as something she belonged to. She didn't call her lawyers or the HOA. Instead, she crawled to the edge of the asphalt where the grove once stood and began to dig with her bare hands.
She wasn't looking for jewelry or lost items, she was looking for a seed. In the months that followed, the neighborhood changed. The strict regulations were ignored, and gardens began to spill over their borders in a riot of color and scent. Beatrice remained, but she was a shadow of the woman she once was, or perhaps she was finally a human being. She spent her days tending to the new grove, a wild, chaotic garden she planted in the ruins of the concrete fountain. She spoke to the insects, and sometimes when the wind was right, the neighbors could hear her laughing. Not the sharp, cruel laugh of the Golden Queen, but the soft, humble chuckle of a woman who finally understood the punchline. The joke was never the curse, nor were the insects. The joke was her own naive belief that she was the one in control, a tiny, fleeting creature trying to dictate terms to an ancient and eternal land. She had been rewarded with the truth, and though it had cost her her pride, it had given her back her soul.